So here we are. Welcome to your session today with Rajkumar Niyogi and Sarah Payton. Today we're going to be talking about the left and the right hemisphere of our brains in the workplace, about where the self-critical voice arises, about what it's like when we listen to it with new and different ears than we've always listened to it before. We'll learn a little bit about the default network and how we try to take care of ourselves with the way we talk to ourselves, which can seem a little counterproductive sometimes. And we'll be able to hear a little bit about how Rajkumari is bringing this information to life in the workplaces that she's been supporting. So,
hello, Sarah. Hello, how are you doing?
I'm well. How are you today?
I am great. I am so excited. This is one of my favorite topics. In fact, every topic that you and I talk about really, truly is my favorite topic. So.
Me too.
So I'd love to start by, kind of knowing more about the default network. This is something that you were chatting about earlier, and I would really love to gain some clarity and understanding.
Yeah. Well, all of us have in these gorgeous brains of ours a way that our brain works automatically. It's the way that there's kind of a toggle, an attentional toggle in our brain, where when we really pay attention to something, where we're intentional about directing our attention, we move into a kind of a purpose-driven brain. we move into an intentional brain, which is wired differently than the way that our brain is wired when we're not using it intentionally. So we have an intentional brain that we use to do things like algebra problems, or to solve a problem that's happening in the workplace, or write a proposal, or follow through on tasks, or conduct a business meeting, or stay in touch with what's happening in the business meeting and make cogent and coherent contributions. This is all our intentional brain. Now, as soon as we stop using our brain intentionally, something very different starts to happen. And scientists call this the default network. They used to think it was just white noise that would happen in between the times when they were asking people to do things. But then they realized that in every person that they were working with, it had a similar pattern. It involved similar parts of the brain. So the default network involves the parts of the brain that think about the self, and they consider the self in our social world. So, for example, the default network is where we daydream. It's where creativity arises from. It's also where we have the self-critical voice, especially if we've lived through any kind of trauma. The default network can have a very negative tone in its relationship to self. So if you just pause for a moment, Rajkumari, and if our listeners just pause for a moment, see what the next thing that floats up is. Just when we aren't asking your brain to do anything, what pops up?
I can speak from a client perspective, and I would say many of them would say anxiety.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anxiety.
For me, anxiety, there's a place of, this is uncomfortable. I don't want to have this. Just happened at a morning meeting. I paused to kind of gather my thoughts, and the person across the table from me said, just noticing how I'm wanting to keep talking because I'm feeling uncomfortable with the silence. So it felt very impressed and appreciative of that level of vulnerability from that person. And for me, I will be quite honest. Right now, I'm looking at the water and thinking how beautiful it is. So that's where I am.
So what arises in me is just a kind of a checking and rechecking of all of my obligations and commitments and everything that I've promised that I would do for people, and have I fulfilled all of my promises? Am I in integrity with myself? What have I not done? And these kinds of things are the things that the default network does. It tries to help us to anticipate what's coming, and it reviews what is past. And if what is past was difficult or painful, then it can even move more towards rumination, what researchers call rumination, which is the painful rehashing and rehashing of past experience that wasn't very fun.
So this is very interesting. So two thoughts are coming to surface for me. One, it sounds like you're talking about the right hemisphere from the default network. Is that so?
The default network runs in both hemispheres. So
both hemispheres. Yeah. Okay, great. I lost my other thought, sorry.
Well, we haven't talked about the left and the right hemispheres today, so I could just take a minute to bring our listeners up to speed on that particular concept. We have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Your brain looks a little bit like a walnut, and you know how walnuts have two halves as well. The brain has these two halves, these two wrinkly halves, covered by a cortex, which is the part of our brain that thinks, that gray part that we always think about when we think about the word brain. And these two halves of our brain look pretty similar. But in terms of the way that they're structured quite differently at the level of the neurons, the cells that are the basic building blocks of the brain, or the basic sort of plant life of the brain, if you will. And the neurons in the left hemisphere are arranged more like a fruit orchard, with rows and columns, and is kind of organized. And information in the left hemisphere passes from neuron to neuron in order to be able to reach from one part of the left hemisphere to the other part of the left hemisphere. In contrast, the right hemisphere is arranged at its neuronal level like the vines of the Amazon forest. The neurons in the right hemisphere travel everywhere and do much more connecting. So the right hemisphere, not just for humans, but throughout the animal kingdom, the right hemisphere, which is used for the apprehension of the environment, of the big picture of the world, our worldview. Actually, the right hemisphere throughout the animal kingdom weighs a little more than the left hemisphere because there's more neural matter in there. So the right hemisphere is a much more sort of immediate place. It's a place where we really kind of grok the world. We apprehend, understand, integrate, and pull in the world immediately in its fullest manifestation. And the left hemisphere, by contrast, works a little more slowly and has kind of a deliberate quality and likes to consider all the details and put things in order and move in an orderly fashion. So both hemispheres do the same things. And in the 1980s, we had those wonderful books that were so fun to do that talked about how the right hemisphere was the creative hemisphere. It turns out that creativity is an integrated hemisphere experience, that we need both the left and the right to be contributing in order to be deeply creative, but that the right hemisphere holds the big picture. It holds the meaning and purpose of what we do and why we do it. So the more that we are in relationship with our values in the decisions that we make in the workplace, the more we're working with an integrated brain. I'll just pause there for a moment, Rajkumari, because I know that you just completed some writing about this in the workplace, the left and right hemispheres. What did you want to bring in here?
Well, this is actually quite fascinating, this concept of rumination. I'm going to kind of thread back to what scientists are talking about rumination, and then you kind of segued into integration. I think for me, one of the kind of key concepts that I talk about with clients, especially in the executive coaching arena, is the 4 boxes of exclusion. And the 4 boxes of exclusion are, for me, entitlement, victimhood, neediness, and righteousness. And what's so interesting is you talk about in the left hemisphere, the need for detail and deliberation and kind of order. I'm wondering if hierarchy also lives in the left hemisphere, because when we either stand in entitlement or victimhood, or if we stand in neediness or righteousness, and there's kind of a seesaw in both of these different paralleled polarities of each, then what happens is we by default find ourselves in some hierarchical stance. One might be more superior to the other, one might be more inferior to the other. And so it's so interesting. I talk about how to step out of these boxes of exclusion and how to find oneself in inclusion is A, by taking a breath and bringing ourselves over into the right hemisphere, first of all. And secondly, in order to be more fully integrated or standing in a place of integration, to look at the components of inclusion, which are creativity, compassion, connection, and curiosity. And so much of those kind of translate directly and are tethered to values within an organization, values at a team level. And from that place, we kind of dive a little deeper into the self and we find meaning, we find purpose. This is where we even talk about inclusion as contribution, right? Diversity is the uniqueness. Inclusion is that contribution that often is valued and sometimes not so much. And that's when we find ourselves being or having the experience of exclusion, right? And then we go into one of those boxes and we're wondering, are we feeling not so great about ourselves? What need is not being met? And how do we kind of react to that rather than respond?
Well, I love the invitation to breathe. That is always a good invitation.
Exactly. And so key and so essential.
And so is there a sense then that when a person has the experience that their contribution isn't really wanted, that people will have the exclusion experience? Or is that how you're linking these?
Absolutely. Thank you for asking for clarification. So one of the things that we wrote in the case study we just finished with Shuttle over an 8-week engagement is that some of the top challenges were difficulty in communication. And when one experiences challenges in communication, there's the potential of not feeling heard, being misunderstood, etc. And it can be coded as disrespect. And we know from the research that feelings of exclusion actually register in the brain as physical injury. And so that's a concept we talk about, rupture and repair. And in that moment that we are having this experience of pain, if you will, and in this place, emotional pain, we are experiencing a rupture. And you had talked, Sarah, some time ago about the amygdala has no sense of time. And this can continue over a course of days, weeks, months even. And every time this person who has had the experience of exclusion or being disrespected, if they code that disrespect as inclusion, then they feel hurt, literally and figuratively. And so the part of the algorithm of rupture is then to do the repair and to invite curiosity, to invite compassion. And how we get there is by stepping outside of those boxes of exclusion, entitlement, victimhood, neediness, righteousness. And we begin to look at how do we language, how do we have mindsets, how do we have behaviors that align ourselves not only with ourselves, but also with the values of the organization and the values of the larger vision, the mission, and finding ourselves becoming more collaborative and moving toward a collective purpose.
Beautiful. So you're speaking very beautifully about the left and the right hemisphere here, which you had mentioned yourself earlier, that the left hemisphere does have that way of making sense of the world by wondering who is responsible, by assigning blame either to self or others. And And as soon as we step into blame, I think we're stepping into exclusion. And as soon as we begin to move away from blame, we're stepping back towards that right hemisphere with the capacity to be motivated by and reference oneself upon the deep values of the organization and our deep personal values and integrity as well.